Berlin, April 1945. The city trembles. Each sunrise is swallowed by smoke. Artillery shells burst like thunder over the Spree River, shaking what remains of streets once filled with life. From the east, the Red Army's guns pound without pause, a constant storm of steel and fire. Civilians huddle in basements beneath the ruins, clutching their children, listening to the slow collapse of their world above. Once Grand Boulevards and unter den Linden, Wilhelmstraße, Friedrichstraße, now lie buried beneath brick and dust. Inside the Führerbunker, 40 feet underground, Adolf Hitler sits beneath flickering light, his hand trembling as he traces lines on a map that no longer resembles reality. Outside, Soviet troops advance block by block, their tanks grinding over rubble, their soldiers hardened by 4 years of vengeance. The heart of the Reich beats faintly, its pulse fading with every explosion. Every street, every building, every breath of air carries the same truth: the end has come. And yet inside the bunker, the voice of the Third Reich still whispers, Berlin will not fall. Late 1944, early 1945, across Eastern Europe, the once mighty Wehrmacht was collapsing. The Red Army, relentless after the victories of Stalingrad and Kursk, surged westward in waves that seemed unstoppable. Each Soviet advance peeled back another layer of Hitler's empire. By January 1945, the front had moved from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River, barely 70 kilometers from Berlin. The Vistula-Oder offensive had shattered German defenses in just 3 weeks. Soviet tanks rolled through Warsaw. The Polish capital, a graveyard of resistance, now watched the Red Army move on toward the Reich itself. The Allies, meanwhile, pressed from the west. After the failure of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, German hopes of splitting Allied forces evaporated. American and British armies were now across the Rhine. 2 great storms were closing in on the heart of Germany, and Berlin stood directly between them. In February 1945, the Yalta Conference brought Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin together. They discussed Germany's inevitable defeat, and, crucially, who would take Berlin. To Stalin, the capture of the Nazi capital was more than a military goal. It was political destiny. For the Soviet Union, which had borne the heaviest casualties of the war, Berlin was the prize that would avenge 4 years of blood and humiliation. Inside Germany, the situation bordered on delusion. Hitler refused to abandon the city or even acknowledge the full extent of the disaster. He believed new miracle weapons, jet fighters, rockets, and phantom divisions that existed only on paper, could somehow turn the tide. His generals knew the truth. The army was exhausted, its ranks filled with boys and old men, its fuel and ammunition almost gone. Still, orders came from the Reich Chancellery demanding total resistance. Every village, every street, every cellar was to be defended to the last man. Goebbels's propaganda echoed this madness, urging civilians to fight for the soul of Germany. The Volkssturm, a militia of the untrained and the desperate, was created to defend the capital. Teenagers in school uniforms were handed Panzerfausts and told to destroy Soviet tanks. By March 1945, entire German armies were disintegrating. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B ceased to exist in the Ruhr pocket. Hundreds of thousands surrendered to the Americans. But on the Eastern Front, surrender was unthinkable. The Red Army's vengeance was feared, and not without reason. Villages burned, prisoners were executed, and refugees fled west in endless columns, desperate to escape both advancing fronts. For the German command, Berlin became a symbol, not a fortress. It was to be defended even if the defense meant annihilation. Hitler appointed General Helmuth Weidling to oversee the city's final stand, placing him under direct authority of the bunker. Weidling's task was impossible. With roughly 90,000 soldiers, many of them wounded or barely trained, he was to resist over 2.5 million Soviet troops equipped with thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. By mid-April, the Oder front line cracked. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's first Belarusian front began its assault on the Silo Heights, the last natural barrier before Berlin. The horizon glowed red for miles as thousands of guns unleashed the heaviest artillery bombardment of the European war. The ground shook as if the earth itself sought to bury the Reich. When dawn came, the German capital could already hear the thunder of Soviet guns. The end, once a distant possibility, had become an echo that filled the air over Berlin. And deep inside the city, civilians began to realize that the war would not pass them by. It would come through their walls. Berlin, early April 1945. The city still functioned, but only barely. Trams ran for a few hours each day, carrying soldiers and civilians past smoking ruins. Electricity flickered, water was scarce, and food was measured in grams. The once proud capital of Europe had become a skeletal fortress, streets lined with barricades, intersections reinforced with wrecked vehicles and sandbags. In the suburbs, Hitler Youth units drilled with wooden rifles. Old men in the Volkssturm patched uniforms with rags and carried Panzerfausts slung across their backs. The Luftwaffe, once a terror of the skies, now had almost no planes left to defend the city. The few that did take off were quickly hunted by Soviet Yak and Le-7 fighters patrolling the skies. Inside the Führerbunker, the mood was one of delusion and denial. Hitler refused to leave Berlin. He told his staff that he would either triumph there or die there. Goebbels, ever the loyal propagandist, turned that decision into a national myth, the idea of a leader standing with his people in their final hour. Each radio broadcast urged Berliners to resist to the last cartridge. But reality spoke louder than propaganda. More than 2 million civilians still remained in the city, most of them women and children. The roads leading west were choked with refugees, their carts and bicycles piled with whatever they could carry. Every day, Soviet artillery crept closer. The rumble of distant bombardment was no longer distant. From the east, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front advanced toward Berlin through the Silo Heights. From the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front pushed through the Spree and aimed to envelop the city from below. Both commanders were under orders from Stalin himself. Berlin must fall, and it must fall quickly. Stalin wanted the world to see the red banner flying over the Reichstag before the Western Allies could reach the capital. It was not only a military goal, it was a symbol of vengeance and dominance. Zhukov's assault on the Silo Heights was brutal and costly. The Germans, entrenched along ridges and marshes, poured machine gun and anti-tank fire into the advancing Soviet lines. The battlefield was a nightmare of mud, smoke, and shattered vehicles. By nightfall of April 17th, Soviet losses reached tens of thousands, yet the offensive pressed on. By April 19th, German defenses finally broke, and Zhukov's tanks poured through toward the city. Simultaneously, Konev's forces from the south reached the outer suburbs of Berlin, Neukölln and Tempelhof, cutting off escape routes for any German troops still retreating from the Oder. The ring around Berlin was closing fast. Inside the bunker, Hitler's maps were marked with blue and red arrows that no longer reflected reality. He ordered units that no longer existed to counterattack. He sacked generals, promoted others, and still believed that Army Group Steiner, a force shattered and scattered days earlier, would somehow relieve Berlin. His staff knew the truth but dared not speak it. The dictator's world had shrunk to a few rooms beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, where he moved between rants, silence, and despair. Outside, Berlin prepared for its final stand. Every bridge was mined. Every canal was fortified. Every street was to become a battlefield, and above all, the Red Army was coming. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the first shells began to fall within the city limits. Flak towers fired blindly into the clouds, their gunners shouting songs to drown the thunder of Soviet artillery. Smoke rose from the outskirts as Soviet tanks pushed into the eastern districts. The Battle of Berlin had begun. Within 10 days, the Third Reich would cease to exist. For the people of Berlin, the battle was not fought on distant fronts. It was fought in their living rooms. Each explosion sent dust raining from ceilings already cracked by months of air raids. Mothers clutched their children in the dark, whispering prayers that no longer seemed to reach heaven. Soviet artillery struck without pause. By the end of April, Berlin was under one of the heaviest bombardments in human history. Over 1.8 million shells fell on the city. The air shimmered with smoke and concrete dust. Day and night became indistinguishable. Civilians who tried to flee often found themselves caught between collapsing buildings and advancing troops. Thousands sought refuge in the U-Bahn tunnels, the underground railways that became makeshift shelters. But even there, safety was an illusion. When Soviet bombs ruptured water mains, tunnels flooded, drowning hundreds. The air became thick with fear and the stench of decay. Those who survived scavenged for food in abandoned shops or burned wreckage for warmth. Every encounter with soldiers, whether Soviet or German, carried danger. Women were especially vulnerable. Reports of mass assaults shadowed the Red Army's advance, a dark echo of the vengeance born at Stalingrad. For many Berliners, survival no longer meant living. It meant enduring another hour. Berlin was not just defended, it was transformed into a labyrinth of death. The streets were narrow, choked with debris, ideal for ambushes. German engineers mined intersections and rigged bridges for demolition. Tank traps were built from the wrecks of old trams and cars. General Helmuth Weidling divided the city into 8 defense sectors, each commanded by a general who barely had the men or weapons to hold his ground. Every block, every intersection was to be contested. Weidling knew it was hopeless. But duty demanded the illusion of order. The defenders numbered roughly 90,000, a mix of Wehrmacht remnants, SS units, police, Volkssturm, and Hitler Youth. They faced over 2.5 million Soviet troops under Zhukov and Konev, supported by nearly 6,000 tanks and 10,000 artillery pieces. The disparity was astronomical. Yet for all its desperation, the defense was brutal. Soviet tanks that advanced into the narrow streets were picked off by Panzerfaust teams hiding in rubble. Every captured building cost lives. Snipers haunted the ruins. Machine guns rattled from upper floors and basements alike. The city became a vertical battlefield. Death could come from any direction. The Soviets responded with overwhelming firepower. Entire city blocks were leveled by Katyusha rockets and heavy guns. Zhukov's troops advanced building by building, room by room, burning out resistance with flamethrowers and grenades. Progress was measured in meters, not kilometers. It was warfare stripped to its bones, primitive, intimate, and merciless. While the city burned, beneath it the Nazi leadership descended into madness. The Führerbunker had become both a command post and a tomb. Hitler's staff, secretaries, officers, couriers, lived in dimly lit corridors reeking of cigarette smoke and damp concrete. Maps hung on the walls showed a front that no longer existed. Outside, reality had collapsed. Inside, denial had become ritual. Reports from the front were grim, yet each one was filtered through layers of self-deception. Hitler still ordered non-existent divisions to strike. He blamed betrayal, cowardice, and fate, anyone but himself. Those around him watched as his health and mind deteriorated. His hands shook uncontrollably. His eyes sunk deep into pale hollows. Between moments of rage came long silences. He would stare at the floor for minutes, then suddenly issue orders that no one could carry out. Joseph Goebbels remained unwaveringly loyal. To him, the coming destruction was not tragedy, it was destiny. He spoke of sacrifice and eternal glory, of Berlin as the stage for Germany's final act. Even as Soviet artillery rocked the streets above, he broadcast messages of defiance, calling on every German to fight to the last breath. Meanwhile, those still capable of reason, generals like Weidling, began to prepare for the inevitable. They saw the end approaching and tried quietly to limit the suffering. But in the bunker, reason had no authority. Only belief, denial, and fanatic loyalty remained. And above them, the walls of Berlin continued to crumble. For the Soviet soldiers who marched into Berlin, this was not just another campaign. It was the end of a 4-year nightmare. From the ashes of Stalingrad to the ruins of Warsaw, they had seen their homeland burned and their comrades buried beneath German boots. Now they were bringing judgment to the city that had unleashed that horror. The Red Army's advance was driven by fury and exhaustion in equal measure. Many soldiers had marched thousands of kilometers through mud, blood, and endless battles. The closer they came to Berlin, the more personal the war became. Each building they stormed, each flag they raised carried the weight of vengeance. Propaganda from Moscow called for retribution. Officers reminded their troops of villages razed, families murdered, and comrades hanged. To some, that meant justice. To others, it meant vengeance without mercy. There were acts of heroism, Soviet soldiers shielding civilians, helping the wounded, feeding the hungry. But there were also atrocities, looting, executions, and assaults that scarred the city's survivors for decades. The Red Army was not a single voice. It was millions of men shaped by suffering, now unleashed upon the cradle of the Reich. For Marshal Zhukov, Victory in Berlin was more than conquest. It was proof of the Soviet Union's supremacy. Every meter gained was a step closer to planting the red banner over the Reichstag, the ultimate symbol of triumph. As the city fell, so too did the myth that had consumed it. The Nazi ideology, once shouted from podiums and paraded in stadiums, now echoed hollowly through empty streets. Posters of Hitler hung torn and blackened on the walls, flapping in the smoke like remnants of a dead religion. Inside the bunker, belief became madness. Hitler raged at his generals for failing him, at his people for being unworthy of victory. He saw betrayal everywhere except within himself. To his final breath, he insisted that destiny had chosen him, even as his empire turned to dust. Many of his followers clung to the same illusion. SS officers fought to the last bullet, not for victory but for an idea that could no longer sustain itself. Others, young soldiers, frightened civilians, began to question everything they had been taught. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. In the ruins of Berlin, the moral center of Nazism disintegrated. The same streets that had once hosted parades of power now echoed with cries of fear. The doctrine of superiority, of domination and purity, ended where it began, in fire and ruin. For the first time in years, silence began to drown out the propaganda. And in that silence, the world saw the true cost of fanaticism. By the last week of April 1945, Germany no longer existed as a functioning state. It was a collection of ruins, fragments, and ghosts. In Berlin, that collapse was tangible, in the faces of soldiers who no longer believed, in the hollow eyes of civilians waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. Inside the bunker, the final breakdown unfolded like a play. Hitler received reports that Soviet troops were within a few hundred meters. When told that Steiner's counterattack had failed, that no reinforcements were coming, something within him finally broke. Witnesses described him trembling with rage, then slumping into silence. On April 22nd, he admitted for the first time that the war was lost. But even in defeat, he refused to surrender. He would die in Berlin, and Germany would die with him. Around him, the hierarchy disintegrated. Some staff planned escape through the tunnels. Others destroyed documents, burned uniforms, or simply waited. Poison capsules were distributed. Goebbels prepared his family for the final loyalty. The bunker, once the center of the Reich, had become a crypt. Above ground, Soviet troops were within sight of the Reich Chancellery. Flames licked the night sky. The sound of battle was now a constant roar. The heart of Nazi Germany was collapsing, not just militarily, but psychologically. The will that once enslaved nations had turned inward, consuming itself. April 25, 1945. The ring around Berlin was complete. From the north, south, and east, Soviet troops converged on the city center. Every escape route had been sealed. The once great capital of Hitler's empire was now a trap. Marshal Zhukov's forces pressed from the northeast through Prenzlauer Berg and Friedrichshain. Konev's first Ukrainian front struck from the south through Tempelhof and Schöneberg. The sound of tanks echoed between the shattered buildings like rolling thunder. Soviet soldiers fought from street to street, using flamethrowers, grenades, and machine guns to clear buildings one room at a time. The Germans fought with fanatic determination. Panzerfausts streaked through the smoke, striking Soviet armor at point-blank range. Each intersection became a fortress, each building a tomb. But the Red Army advanced relentlessly. By April 27th, Soviet tanks had crossed the Spree River. They were less than a kilometer from the Reich Chancellery. The city's defenders, once counted in tens of thousands, were now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere had turned spectral. Hitler received reports of Soviet troops within sight of the Brandenburg Gate. Maps meant nothing now. The front lines were outside the very doors of his command post. That same day, communication with the outside world ceased. No messages, no reinforcements, no hope. Hitler's staff began preparing for the inevitable. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, refused to leave his side. She had joined him in the bunker weeks earlier, bringing with her an eerie calm. They were to be married, not in triumph, but in the shadow of annihilation. On April 28th, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler, his most trusted lieutenant, had attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. The news shattered what little remained of his faith in those around him. To him it was the ultimate betrayal, a knife in the back at the moment of death. He withdrew to his private quarters. Witnesses recalled his face, pale, trembling, eyes sunk deep into shadow. He spoke of betrayal, destiny, and vengeance, words that now meant nothing. The Reich he had built was collapsing above him, every explosion shaking the walls of his final refuge. Outside, Soviet soldiers were storming the government district. The Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, stood before them, a burned-out husk surrounded by trenches, barricades, and sniper nests. To Stalin, capturing that building would be the ultimate victory, the image that would define the war. On the morning of April 29th, Soviet artillery unleashed a final barrage. The ground shook for hours. The Reichstag's dome collapsed, its walls burning from the inside. Soviet infantry surged forward under a storm of machine gun fire. Hundreds fell, but still they came, wave after wave, determined to plant the red banner atop the ruins. Inside the chancellery, the bunker shook with every impact. Hitler sat at his desk, dictating his last will and testament. He married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony witnessed by his staff. There was no music, no celebration, only silence. Afterward, he retired to his study with Eva. At 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. Adolf Hitler was dead. His body, alongside Eva's, was carried into the garden above, doused in petrol, and set alight as Soviet shells rained down. The flames flickered weakly amid the smoke, the pyre of a collapsing empire. Down in the bunker, those who remained stared in silence. Some wept, others whispered prayers, and a few simply sat motionless, waiting for the end. Above them, the Red Army was breaking through the final defenses. The Reichstag was surrounded. Soviet soldiers stormed its shattered staircases, clearing the halls room by room. Snipers fired from the gallery. Machine guns rattled in the corridors. By nightfall, a red flag was raised on the roof, one of many that would follow. Photographs would later immortalize a single moment. A Soviet soldier standing above the Reichstag, banner in hand, smoke rising all around. The symbol of victory, and of vengeance, now waved over the heart of the Reich. But even as the flag rose, the killing did not stop. April 30th, 1945 evening. Smoke rolled across the government district like a living thing. The smell of burning oil and bodies filled the air. Soviet searchlights cut through the haze as Red Army troops poured into the heart of Berlin. The Reichstag was now a graveyard of brick and ash. Thousands had died for a single building, whose political power had already been erased by years of dictatorship. Yet for Stalin and the Soviet Union, its capture was more than symbolic. It was the end of the war in Europe made visible to the world. Inside the Führerbunker, the truth could no longer be ignored. Word of Hitler's death spread quietly from room to room. There was no announcement, no ceremony, only a strange, heavy silence. Some staff members broke down in tears. Others, numb from exhaustion and fear, continued their duties as if routine could delay reality. Joseph Goebbels, now chancellor of a non-existent state, gathered his family. He refused to flee, declaring that a world without National Socialism was not worth living in. On May 1st, he and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden, the same spot where Hitler's ashes still smoldered in the ruins above. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of Berlin's defense, had been fighting an impossible war. His soldiers were starving, out of ammunition, and scattered among the rubble. He knew continuing to resist meant only more death for the civilians trapped with them. On May 2nd, Weidling sent word to the Soviets that Berlin would surrender. That morning, the guns finally fell silent. The Red Army marched through the ruined streets, their faces marked by exhaustion rather than triumph. For them, the victory was total, but it had been bought with immense blood. Nearly 80,000 Soviet soldiers had died in the Battle of Berlin, and another 280,000 were wounded. For the Germans, the cost was equally catastrophic. Over 90,000 defenders were killed, and tens of thousands of civilians perished in the inferno that consumed their city. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. The once mighty capital of Europe was now a landscape of rubble and smoke. When Soviet officers entered the bunker, they found a scene of eerie stillness. Papers littered the floors. Telephones hung dead on the walls. The rooms where Hitler had ruled were empty, their silence heavy with the echo of collapse. In one corner, a small bloodstain marked the place where the dictator's final act had ended 12 years of tyranny. Across the city, German soldiers emerged from basements and cellars with white cloths tied to sticks. Some cried openly, others simply stared at the ruins around them in disbelief. Berlin, once the symbol of Nazi power, was now nothing more than a grave. Above the city, Soviet banners fluttered on every surviving building. Victory was absolute, and yet it carried no joy. Too much had been lost on all sides for celebration. That night, as fires continued to burn across the skyline, Marshal Zhukov reported to Stalin, "Berlin is taken." The message marked the end of the war in Europe's heart, and the death of the regime that had plunged the world into darkness. But for millions, the war was not yet over. The world still had to confront what the Reich had left behind. May 1945. Berlin was silent. For the first time in years, no bombs fell, no guns fired, and no commands echoed through the air. Only the wind moved through the ruins, carrying the smell of smoke, dust, and death. The Battle of Berlin had lasted just over 2 weeks, yet it felt eternal to those who survived it. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich now resembled a lunar landscape. Entire districts were flattened. Bridges lay collapsed into rivers choked with wreckage. Trams hung twisted from broken lines. The city that had once dreamed of empire had become a monument to destruction. The civilian cost was staggering. Of Berlin's 2.7 million remaining inhabitants, tens of thousands were dead and hundreds of thousands were homeless. Every open space, parks, courtyards, even former parade grounds became graveyards. Makeshift wooden crosses stretched as far as the eye could see. For those still alive, survival was its own battle. Water and electricity were gone. Food was scarce. Diseases spread quickly through overcrowded shelters. Children scavenged in the streets for scraps while the elderly searched for lost relatives amid the ruins. The Soviet occupation was both liberation and reckoning. For the Red Army, this was the culmination of years of unimaginable suffering, but also the beginning of vengeance. While many Soviet soldiers behaved with compassion, others took retribution into their own hands. Looting, executions, and assaults cast a long shadow over the victory. For Berlin's civilians, the end of the war did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of terror. Yet amid the chaos, a strange order began to reemerge. Soviet officers organized food distribution. Medical units treated both soldiers and civilians. Posters went up announcing curfews and restrictions. A new authority was taking shape, one not of the Reich but of occupation. Meanwhile, far from Berlin, the news spread across a shattered continent. In London, Paris, and Washington, crowds filled the streets, cheering and weeping as radio broadcasts confirmed the fall of the Nazi capital. For the Allied nations, the nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally nearing its end. But the euphoria was tempered by horror. As Allied and Soviet troops advanced deeper into Germany, they began uncovering the concentration camps, the full magnitude of what had been done in the name of the Reich. Buchenwald, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, names that would forever define the darkest side of human history. In Berlin, even those who had believed in Hitler's vision were confronted with the truth. The propaganda had promised glory. Reality had delivered ashes. A regime built on lies, fear, and hatred had consumed itself and its people. The world stood at a crossroads, celebrating victory, yet facing the moral and physical wreckage left behind. And in the center of it all lay Berlin, the city that had once been the beating heart of tyranny, now silent beneath the red banners of its conquerors. But the story of Berlin's fall did not end with its surrender. From its ruins, new powers were rising, and a new conflict was already beginning to form in the shadows. The guns had gone silent, but peace did not return easily. Berlin, the epicenter of the Nazi dream, was now the crucible of a new world order. The victors stood over its ruins, each with their own vision of what should rise from them. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the map of Germany was redrawn. The nation that had once sought to dominate Europe was now carved into 4 occupation zones: Soviet in the east, American, British, and French in the west. Berlin, though deep within Soviet territory, was likewise divided, a symbolic reminder that the city's fate would be the world's test. The Soviet Union moved swiftly to consolidate control in its sector. Communist leaders returned from exile under Moscow's supervision, rebuilding a new political structure on the ashes of fascism. Factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Newspapers, schools, and institutions were reshaped under a socialist vision. For many Germans, it felt like trading one dictatorship for another. In the western sectors, the Americans, British, and French pursued a different path. They focused on reconstruction, reviving local government, restoring industry, and encouraging democracy. The contrast between East and West grew sharper with every passing month. And though few realized it then, the division of Berlin foreshadowed the division of the world. By 1947, the alliance that had defeated Hitler was fracturing. Mutual suspicion between the Soviet Union and the West hardened into open hostility. Winston Churchill's warning of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe had become prophecy. Berlin, once the capital of the Reich, was now the front line of a new ideological war. In 1948, tensions erupted in the first major crisis of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade. Stalin sought to starve the western zones into submission by cutting off all rail, road, and canal routes into the city, but the Allies refused to yield. For nearly a year, American and British aircraft flew around the clock in what became known as the Berlin Airlift, delivering food, fuel, and supplies to 2 million civilians trapped in the western half of the city. Planes landed every few minutes, day and night, defying Soviet pressure. When the blockade finally ended in May 1949, it was clear Berlin would remain divided, but free people would not abandon it. Later that same year, two new Germanys were born. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, emerged under democratic principles. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, rose under Soviet control. Berlin, split yet indivisible, became the ultimate symbol of their struggle. For decades, the city would remain a scar across Europe's heart. Walls would rise where avenues once stood. Spies, soldiers, and civilians would live under the shadow of nuclear tension. The world's fate would again pivot around Berlin, not through bombs and tanks, but through ideology and fear. And yet, even amid that tension, life slowly returned. Children played among the ruins. Music filled the streets once more. Berliners, stubborn and resilient, rebuilt their city brick by brick, determined that history's darkest chapter would not define them forever. The Third Reich was gone. Its dream of domination lay buried beneath its own rubble. But from that same ground, a new Germany, divided, humbled, and wiser, began to emerge. And the story of Berlin, the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, would continue to shape the fate of the modern world, because the fall of Berlin was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new era. The fall of Berlin was not merely the end of a war, it was the end of an illusion of invincibility, an illusion that fear could hold an empire together, an illusion that power, unrestrained, could ever outlast the human cost it demands. When Berlin fell, so too did the myth of absolute control. The Third Reich had sought to shape the world through domination and terror, yet in the end it could not even save itself. Its leader died in the very city he had promised would never fall. Its ideology, built on hatred and conquest, consumed everything in its path, including those who believed in it most. But history is not only about endings. From the ruins of 1945, something remarkable began to stir. Across Europe, nations scarred by war chose cooperation over vengeance. Former enemies built alliances instead of armies. And out of the ashes of totalitarianism, democracy slowly took root again. Fragile, imperfect, but enduring. Berlin became both a warning and a mirror. A warning of what happens when humanity surrenders to ideology, a mirror reflecting our capacity to rebuild, to forgive, and to learn. Its streets, once the stage of destruction, would later echo with the sound of hammers tearing down the wall, the symbol of division that had replaced the Reich's tyranny. In the end, the fall of Berlin reminds us that no fortress, no army, and no dictator can outlast the will of people who yearn to be free. Empires may rise and crumble, but truth endures, whispered through the ruins, carried by survivors, remembered by history. And as the smoke of that final battle faded into the spring of 1945, the world stood reborn, forever changed by the price of its own redemption.